Okay, we're ready to begin the discussion portion of the event. Again, thank everyone for coming. What did you think of the movie? Good? Yeah, it's beautiful, wasn't it? We were in the back and we were tempted to just come out and say, well, that pretty much sums it up, so there's not a lot we can add to it. But let me quickly introduce to you the panel. Their full bios are in the program that you received when you came in. Carrie Smith, who's sitting next to me, is a social influencer, we might say. She hosts and is a co-host and co-created a very popular podcast called Unsafe Space. She has appeared on some of the most popular podcasts that deal with culture and deal with critical race theory and the social justice movement. She's also interviewed a lot of the leading intellectuals when it comes to those subjects, people like Brett Weinstein, James Lindsay, Charles Murray, right? And her writing has been cited by such luminaries as Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. When my son Neil read all the bios, he said that we should put Carrie's bio at the top. She was obviously the most impressive of the three of us. Sitting next to her is Julia Mann. She is a local artist in Austin. And you got to see some of her artwork when you came in. It was being projected on the screen. She is an illustrator, and she studied at Virginia Tech, correct? Studio art. And she's also a commissioned artist. Okay, so as I said in the intro, the question that is, we hope to guide our discussion, again, is what led producers of this film to want to essentially ban it, just to scrub it from social media? What's so dangerous about this documentary that they worked pretty hard to prevent anyone from seeing it? And it's kind of an ambitious it's an ambitious goal for this discussion, but we're going to give it a shot. What we're going to do is talk for a while, maybe about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions and comments. So be thinking about things you might want to ask or say. So I thought maybe there are several pieces, I think, to the puzzle of trying to figure out why this film is banned. And so what I'm going to do is introduce one of those pieces, and then we're going to discuss it, and then we'll discuss the next piece. The first, and you see all of these in the film, but some of it is sort of the backstory of the film. Some of it is the cultural and philosophical context in which this film is operating. But I think one of the ways to start to understand why there would be a movement, why Roger Scruton would want to make this movie in the first place, and then why there would be a movement to erase it, to get rid of it, is because there has been essentially, in the history of Western civilization, there's been essentially two ways in which people have understood the concept of beauty. The first way, and the way that's dominated for the vast majority of time, and you go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and of course throughout Christendom, and really up until very recently, people thought that, if you look at a painting, if you look at, let's say, a Caravaggio, right, and you're moved by that painting, and you say, wow, that is a beautiful painting. What you seem to be doing in saying that is you seem to be making a judgment of some kind, what we might call an aesthetic judgment, which is to say that there is a standard of beauty by which you are judging that painting and determining that it meets that standard. And perhaps even more specifically, what you're doing is you're saying that there is something about the painting that actually has this property called beauty, a property that's intrinsic to the painting itself. And throughout almost all of that tradition, as Scruton mentions, that standard has been viewed as an objective standard. And to be even more specific, it's a standard that's rooted in the divine being. So because God is beautiful, the thought is that then everything else and in fact, God is the beautiful. Everything else is a reflection. Everything else that is beautiful is a reflection of that divine beauty. Or if you want to think of it in Platonic terms, all the beauty we see in the world participates in the beautiful, which Plato would, as Scruton said, Plato would recognize that as being the divine. So that's the tradition that's dominated in the West for almost near thousands of years, we could even say. But in the last couple hundred years, it's faced significant scrutiny. There are a lot of people, a lot of modern people and a lot of postmodern people who have thought that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that there's no accounting for taste. These kinds of cliche expressions which represent a kind of aesthetical relativism. And how people then think about that, when I look at a painting and I say it's beautiful, from this perspective, what they would say is happening there is that essentially all I'm doing in saying that something is beautiful is just expressing emotion, right? I'm just emoting. I'm just expressing my own personal taste. I'm not actually saying anything about the painting itself, nothing that's intrinsic to the painting. But I'm just simply expressing my own personal, emotional reaction to seeing this particular object. And so what that means then is that one person might say, well, I think Lady Gaga's Bad Romance is more beautiful than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And somebody else might say, well, actually, I think Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is more beautiful than Lady Gaga's Bad Romance. You're impressed that I know that song, right? The Bad Romance. And here's the thing. In this understanding, those two things are essentially equivalent, right? They are both equally valid statements. Because all beauty then is just an expression of your emotions. It's just talking about your preference. It's like me saying I like chocolate ice cream and you saying you like vanilla. And that's what lies behind a phrase that's used several times as Scruton is talking, or there are clips of other interviewers talking to these postmodern artists or late modern artists, where they say, it's art because I say it's art. Right? It's beautiful because I say it's beautiful. Because in this view, the standard of beauty is either just a cultural construction, right? It's something that each culture creates. They create their own vision of Athena. And every culture is different, and some cultures are dramatically different. They can have dramatically different understandings of beauty. Or if we go later in history, it really is just an individual. I myself get to construct my own personal taste. And so where that leaves us then is in the space that the art community is in, and we're going to use sort of the art community perhaps in our discussion as a metaphor or one example of this kind of ideology that is everywhere. So I want to stop. So that's sort of the first piece of the puzzle, is that there has been this dramatic shift in how we understand, how we conceive of beauty. One from which there is an objective standard, that we're actually saying something about the object itself, and then of course anything that would be art would be something that meets that standard. This dramatic shift in late modernity to say, no, actually there is no standard, it's just culturally relative or individually relative. And so we're not saying anything. Okay, so perhaps, Julia, maybe we'll start with you. In your experience as an artist and going to school for art, is Scruton wrong? Because some criticism of this film is to say that this is a distorted picture. Yeah, there are some works of art where people intentionally make it ugly, right? Mm-hmm. But this is a distortion of the way the art community is. In your experience, and maybe tying back to this notion of this new wave where we just get rid of the standards altogether. In your experience, would you say that this is representative of the art community, the art world, or?
Yes. I would say, So I went to I went to Virginia Tech back, and I graduated in 2002. So when I was at art school, I went for a biology degree and then switched halfway through to art. So it was, and while I was there, especially my painting professor, we would have these 3-hour studios, and he was very close friends with Jackson Pollock's wife, and the guy who, splattered paint all over the canvases. And so he loved very abstract art. And when I was in college, and I still, as you can see, the art that y'all had see on the screen, I'm very more realism, try to make beauty into my work. And so in college, I would paint for my studio pieces, like fruit, like strawberries, bananas. Just one painting was just a bunch of apples. But he would spend the 3 hours kind of tearing apart art. And if you did, the abstract piece, he would love it. And he talked 3 hours about all the meanings that it could be. And I didn't understand any of it. And then I would put up my banana or my apple painting, and he would tear it apart. And then he would say that there was something sexual about the stem. And I'm like, it's not. It's really just an apple stem. I promised. And he basically did not like any of my art. And so that was definitely college. And then even, I would say, when we would do art history lessons in college, my professors that would do art history, they would focus a lot, again, on the sexual part or the, kind of twisted part of their meaning of the artwork instead of more of the history. And a few of us were Christians and actually did try to talk to the professors about it and just kind of, see can we focus on more of the beauty, and definitely did not go over well. They did not change their ways. But that was back in 2000, 2002, so I'm sure it's even way worse now. So that was in college. Yeah. So
when they would criticize, you're trying to do something that, as you said, realism and create something beautiful. What was the primary criticism as to, what was wrong with that approach? Why couldn't you just do that and somebody else is doing more abstract art? What was the thinking of the criticism?
I don't know. I mean, I guess, professors usually they like, I guess I say art is subjective, so they like art that's more like their own style. And so because my style was definitely probably not in his, I don't know. It was just enjoy, and then would try to find something disgusting about it. When really it's just like that, his quote about how a flower is a flower. I mean, I wanted to paint fruit because it's beautiful and the colors in it were beautiful, which was not, there was no other meaning besides it's a beautiful piece of fruit, and I wanted to make it beautiful. So.
I think it stems from the underlying ideology that's currently become popular in culture. So deconstructionism, which is a part of this postmodern Marxist ideology that when you call me a social influencer, I was laughing. I thought you were going to call me a social justice warrior, which is what I used to be. Yeah. But I think I didn't go to art school, but at college I was a women's studies minor, and as part of that minor, what we learned was that everything is a construction, that all of our values and all of our Western values are a social construction, and we need to deconstruct everything. And so I think the idea of you just doing a flower because it's beautiful is not sufficient in this culture that says it must be deconstructed and we must figure out the deeper meaning, and and then of course putting in whatever that professor's idea of meaning, whether it's something sexual or otherwise, onto it. But I think a lot of this stems from this ideology that's become very popular, especially in the past year.
Well, to go to the Tracy Emin thing again, where she says it's art because I say it's art, right? You can tell there's some anger in her voice when the interviewer is sort of questioning, saying, well, it's not really beautiful. What is this exactly, right? It's beautiful because I say it's beautiful. There's like a frustration. And that kind of leads us into the second part of this, which is that I think where that anger is coming from, what she's angry at is the old tradition, right? The tradition that said that there is an objective standard of beauty, And what that means then is if there is a standard, then there's judgment that comes with it, right? If there's a hierarchy, that means that people are going to be excluded from it. And so if there is an objective standard of beauty, then in order for something to be art, it has to conform itself to that standard. And, of course, Tracy Emin, if you look at her artwork, it doesn't conform itself to that standard of beauty whatsoever, right? It actually rebels against it. And so it seems to me that, just like you're saying, that what's taking place now in this art, and the reason why it's so destructive and deconstructive, is that this really is a rebellion against the previous style. I mean, it's a kind of classic in a way, right? It seeks to tear down every single image of the sacred order, we might say, because it really is it's rooted in the divine image, right? This standard of beauty, and I think it's interesting because we see several of these in the film, but also if you know Tracy Emin's work or her paintings and drawings, it's usually the human form. It's often the human form that's being desecrated, right? Where she usually uses women as subjects, and they're usually don't have any clothes on, and the position they're in is like the most degrading position she puts them in. They don't have a head, or they're faceless, and then she's just like throws blood on it and distorts it. It's like if you think about it from a biblical point of view, of all of creation, the pinnacle of creation, of course, is man, right? He reflects God's glory the most, more than anything else in this world. He reflects his beauty, or he has the potential to do so. And so I think it's interesting that one of the primary targets is they're tearing down all of these icons, right? All of these reflections of divine beauty. The human form itself is one of the primary targets of that. And so here's what I want you guys to talk about with regards to that, because trying to go back to the ideology and bring that in. From Tracy Emin's point of view, the old West, the old tradition, right, where there is a standard, and she thinks there isn't a standard. So what she thinks when she looks back at history, her view of history, right, is to say that what's happened for the vast majority of in the art community in the West is that the majority culture, right, has privileged one particular vision of what beauty is, and it's imposed it upon all of the minority cultures, right? So it privileges the one form because it says that it's objective, and she thinks it isn't. And then that marginalizes the minority culture's vision of what is beautiful. So there's this oppression that's been taking place in the art community for thousands of years, in which this thing that they say is a standard, which really isn't a standard, is being forced upon everyone else. And so, if you don't have the skill to do it, you don't have the talent, or you don't dedicate the time or whatever in order to develop these particular skills, then you're excluded from it, right? What you do is not real art. So it seems to me that her art, she thinks in her mind, is liberating from that, right? It's saying there is no standard. It's throwing off the standard, and in fact, it's a rebellion against it. And so it seems to me this is just a microcosm of almost every human institution of what's happening, don't you think?
I do. It's also happening in math now. We're seeing the postmodernist Marxist influence, seriously saying that math is racist and oppressive. What's interesting is that they put forward this really condescending, racist and sexist idea that things like math and logic and reason and standards of beauty, being on time, that these things are all functions of whiteness, which is so offensive to anyone who's not white. And somehow they seem to be, for the most part, getting away with it currently. The Smithsonian Museum, for example, was doing an exhibit on these supposed white cultural values and things like math being white. And I don't know if they've checked the stats, but we're currently being beat by Asians at math. So
Right.
they're better at whiteness than we are.
Yeah.
But But yeah, it is infiltrating everything. The one place I haven't seen it really sort of move into yet is sports. So I've seen it in music. There's a professor at Oxford who's currently pushing for Oxford to, quote unquote, decolonize music, and they're saying that asking students of color to learn to play the piano is oppressive, and that it makes them frustrated and anxious, which I don't know if they know that many of the greatest pianists have been black. Again, it's this racist idea they're putting forward. So I've seen it in music. There are some music schools that are now also, that had switched over to blind auditions in order to take away any racial or gender-based prejudice that might have existed in the admissions process. And they did see the percentages of women and people of color increase at some of these music schools slightly, but not as much as they wanted. So now they're getting rid of blind auditions so that they can see what race and sex you are, because that's very important and more important than how well you play the violin. So I've seen it in music, but I haven't seen it in sports yet. No one is saying we need more short Jewish basketball players in the NBA. Let's make sure we get that.
Or one. Yeah.
Or let's get you, Bradley.
Yeah,
we seem to have
Norwegians. Yeah.
we seem to have no problem with meritocracy when it comes to sports, but I do think it will eventually arrive. I do think they'll eventually say these standards of how well you perform are oppressive.
So it's sort of it's one way to think of it is, in the traditional approach, at the top of the hierarchy is truth, goodness, and beauty, right? It's God himself represented in that what's sometimes called the Platonic triad. So he's on the elite side of the hierarchy, he's at the top. And everybody else, at least in the Christian view, is equal, right? There's neither slave nor free, Greek or Jew. So there's a complete egalitarianism when it comes to people, but when it comes to truth, goodness, and beauty, right, that's where the hierarchy exists. It seems to me that what's happened is they're flipping the hierarchy upside down. They think they're eliminating the hierarchy, right? You're taking truth, goodness, and beauty, and you're saying these things are not objective values. There is no such thing. Or perhaps a more subtle position is to say we can't come to know, even if there is objective truth, goodness, and beauty. But so there's a leveling of that, and they think that it's a complete leveling across the board, right, to make it sort of an even playing field. But that's not how that works, I don't think. I think what happens is you're actually turning the hierarchy upside down. So what you see then is we start to have this sort of elitism amongst certain people, right? So it's kind of like it's a masking for really just a grab for power. But one thing I want you guys to comment on is the other thing is this sort of resentment that's present in this, right? It's these in the way you talked about your art professors. I feel like it's there. There's a resentment towards these old standards. I guess that's what's driving the iconoclasm. But and Carrie, I want you to talk about this. It's not. They talk about being enlightened and awoken to reality, and they speak of it in glowing terms, like this is something we want. But most of the people that are deep within this, they strike me as sort of miserable people, right? Driven by this kind of ressentiment or resentment.
That was definitely my experience. So I subscribed to this ideology for about 20 years. And, I was looking through old photos recently, and even the way I dressed back then was so muted and, drab colors. I think there's a lot of, it's funny because like you said, on the one hand, they view themselves as enlightened and as pushing past boundaries and hierarchies. But I think you're right. They're actually just imposing a different hierarchy. So, for example, they didn't look at your artwork and say, this is equally valid and beautiful in this world where we have no boundaries and no hierarchies. They said, no, your work's at the bottom because yours was more traditional.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually true, too, for I'm an illustrator. When I moved to Austin, my goal was to become a children's book illustrator, and so worked really hard to get into that profession. I went to a convention that was all for children's book writers and illustrators, and I just remember listening to the editors talk, and they were all about pushing the buttons, like, it cannot, like, not traditional. So what I do is considered old-fashioned. It's not really wanted in the children's book realm right now. Everything needs to be super clean. It's very computer-generated, digital art. But also just, it has to push buttons. It has to, like, how can you push the envelope more and push the diversity. Whereas someone who I may just draw, like, for example, I draw the Pied Piper, and I draw a beautiful scene of the Pied Piper in Germany, and it was not good enough. They liked the example of one, the editor loved one where they had turned the Pied Piper, I forgot how it was, the children were zombies going after the Pied Piper, and that they were just like, this is amazing, and it's something different. And so it's just seeing that over and over again. It's discouraging at times, because it's the focus on, it's just how can you shock people and push the diversity, and there's no room for old-fashioned or beautiful illustrations.
I think, do you think part of, to get back to your question about resentment, I sometimes think that the critics who are driving the idea of what is considered art or beautiful or has value, I sometimes think that the critics themselves are fueled by resentment because they're not creating. So whether it's film critics who, I don't know if you guys have been to Rotten Tomatoes recently, but if you look at their critic score for films versus the audience score, they're almost completely opposite these days. So if the audience loves it and gives it an 86% rating, you can pretty much bet the critics are giving it 12%, and then vice versa. So they're telling us constantly, no, this movie that was awful, that you all hated, was wonderful because it's teaching us about this, lessons about this ideology is what it's teaching us, and it's putting that first, and you guys are just uncultured rubes who don't understand that this is so great. But I think a lot of those film critics, like art critics, the ones who presume to tell us what has value these days, I think maybe they're just resentful that they can't do beautiful art and they can't make movies, and so they get to be the ones to decide what's good and what's bad.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not a creator, you're a consumer, and if you can't create, you want to tear it down a lot of times, I think, so.
Well, it's so easy, right? I mean, if to create something beautiful is so difficult, it requires so much more skill, so much more time and effort, and, the failure rate is, I think, so much higher, because one of the things I love about the film, and if you really like this film and you want to dig into it more, Roger Scruton has a little book, the title of which is something like a short introduction to beauty. It's Cambridge Press. But it's like 100 pages maybe, but it's so dense. Just like this film, you could I watched this film maybe, 8 or 10 times. And every time I watch it, I get something new from it. His book is like that too. So if you want to have a book you can read for the next 10 or 20 years and not exhaust everything that's in there. But one of the things that he talks about in that particular book is this idea, and he talks about it in the film too, that it's not just about recreating reality, right? That's not what art is. That's, it takes skill and you have to learn it, and, sort of like, or the photorealism, which might be a real high level of skill. But that's not really the point. The point is to do hyper-reality, right? To try to capture the essence of something, like the Stabat Mater, which is trying to capture the essence of suffering itself through the suffering of Mary as she stands at the cross, which is, it's just incredibly difficult to do. I mean, you could make a lot of art and, or do a lot of work, and you may only be able to accomplish that kind of feat, a few times, right? I mean, there's certain works of art that have stood the test of time because they really can connect us to the transcendent in that way. They really are beautiful in that way. But, like you said in the film, it's so much easier now. Now it's just about originality. Now it's just about, coming up with the next silly idea, like duct taping a banana to a wall in a museum, until someone comes along and eats it, and then
it's still art.
Yeah, It's funny because somebody was going to buy that, I think, for a tremendous amount of money. But when the guy ate it, they couldn't really press charges against him because it was just a banana, right? I mean, there's nothing to it. It's just an idea. It's a bald idea. And once, and it's an idea, as it says in the film, that could be exhausted in its verbal description, and that's it, right? True beauty it has that inexhaustible nature to it where you can go back to it time and again and still get something out of it. So we actually are at a point now where we're going to open it up for questions and comments from the audience. So Jim's going to stand down here. That was an alien invasion. That was
Woohoo!
1 second. Sorry about that.
If anyone has a question, you can come meet me at the step. And that way I don't have to try to, maneuver through the auditorium. Does anyone have any questions?
I see a lot of elbowing. Go. Go ask a question.
Hi.
Hi.
When I was watching, Carrie, I used to kind of be this, you seem more of a SJW. I was more of a floater in this world of I always think of it when I look back of it as jargon. The more jargon something could be attached to it, then that wheel could just kind of keep spinning, and this sort of the ideas of just kind of sound and fury, but not really signifying anything. And whereas your art was more invoking a spontaneous kind of just reaction to life, and there's simplicity and beauty into that, but there's not really. It's difficult to impose a lot of jargon onto that, and so I'm wondering if that is maybe the difference between what the film is talking about and a lot of the problems that we're seeing today in our culture. I don't know who that question is to, but
I will say thank you. When I used to go to, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but when I used to go to art museums and I would see postmodernist art, and one example I remember was an artist who, this was in Los Angeles at LACMA, I believe. Her art was taking stuffed animals and ripping the stuffing out and putting it on a pedestal. That was her art. And I remember looking at stuff like that where there would be lots of text and jargon on the wall about what this symbolized, and doubting my gut reaction that this wasn't beautiful, and think, well, I guess I'm not smart enough to get it. But I'm here to learn. And I just think that stuff is garbage. I think we have to get over being afraid of speaking our opinion on what has value and what doesn't. And the same thing goes for the social justice ideology itself. The postmodernist Marxism it's a lot of jargon. And if you guys try to read any of these works, they come up with a lot of pseudo-academic language to make it sound intellectuals. I think so that when people read it, they're like, oh, I guess I just don't understand white fragility, but there must be something here. It's got all these big words. And anyway, that you made me think of that when I used to go to art museums, and I don't know if other people have had that experience of thinking, oh, it must be me. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like with the oak tree, I think it was, where it's the glass shelf and the water cup, and how you have to explain why this is an oak tree, not just a glass of water on a shelf. And I mean, it's not. It's just
a glass of water. Can I say something about Julia's art?
Yeah.
And somebody else wants to come up, I'll say this while they're coming up. Julia's art, like you said, just evokes this gut feeling, I think, of beauty and playfulness and nostalgia in some cases. And she has started selling her art at Comic-Con. I'm going to let you tell what that's like. But I love that you're doing
because of Carrie.
This.
I mean, she was one of the first people I ever told this idea to. So I had met Carrie, and I had never gone to a Comic-Con growing up. It's definitely totally opposite of my personality, and but I had listened to this podcast for artists on why you should do one, and I just remember it being my heartstrings being pulled of I thought that maybe that's for artists that are super successful or have worked at Disney and have a huge following, but I just had this pull. And so I remember I just started getting to know Carrie and mentioned it to her, and it was like, yes, because she used to go to them. And so I went to one just to check it out, and I thought, my stuff does not fit in here because it's all very dark. But I met another artist there, and thankfully I found her booth, and she was like, no, you need to be here because your work is different. And so I told Carrie about it, and sure enough, I signed up for my first convention back in 2019 before COVID, and it was amazing. I specifically, when you go into a convention, everybody's artist booths there's like black backdrop, black tablecloths, and all the artwork is, comic book art. A lot of it is very, not appropriate drawings of women, just, it's not beautiful. A lot of comic book stuff, or a lot of like horror art, and that is not me. And so my booth is all white backdrop and white tablecloth, and then all the art is, it's positive. And I didn't know what to expect, but it was amazing. I mean, I had people from all ages that would flock over, and because I guess the art brings them back to their childhood, or just there's some joy in it, and it's safe. It's a safe place for them to come see. A child can come to my booth and not be scared. And so it's literally, not even realizing it, I'm a light in a very dark place. And I love it. And it's a way of actually being able to encourage artists, or even people that haven't done art since they were little and want to get back into it. And it's just a place where they can come and feel safe. And I can give them a hug or encourage them. And I mean, as you know, going to them, it can be a very dark place, and a lot of people are hurting. So, I don't know.
It made me think of when you're talking about the dark art, everything we're saying isn't saying that art can't deal with tragedy and terrible suffering, right? It can deal with all of these things. But the difference is it doesn't do so in an ugly way, in a way that communicates to the audience that this is all there is. Yeah. The randomness of life, the suffering of life, that it's just utterly meaningless. The way so much of postmodern art, again, I think because of that resentment, the way it's created, it's just all ugly. If you express that kind of suffering, but in beautiful imagery, as Scruton says, it redeems it, right? Because it transports you to another world. It gives you hope that there is something beyond this life. And, it gives you consolation because of that, because it's pointing you to the transcendent, it's pointing you to the divine, ultimately. And so it's not to say that you can't deal with dark subjects, right? So much of the great art deals with dark and, and evil and darkness, but it does so in a way that redeems it. And if we lose that, as Scruton is saying, then, it is going to just be a wasteland. We're all going to become zombies. It's just complete, it's going to be just dehumanization and in a very, very dark place. But it also makes me think that if you're a Christian artist and you are creating beauty, there's a market for you, right? There's an opportunity. And this is probably true of every industry, right? Mm-hmm. That there's an opportunity to say, we're actually going back to the old style. And it seems that people are going to start coming out of, the darkness and say, yeah, actually that is garbage. I never thought that was good. I was guilted into saying it was good, or manipulated in some way into saying it's good. And I'm done with that. And I'm going to flock to this alternative because, they want to get away from the darkness and come to the light. So
that's great.
Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
All right. So it's kind of piggybacking on your last comment, actually. For my wife and I were talking about, a lot of this modern art, and we were saying nobody naturally would come to the conclusion that most of this is beautiful, which means they had to be taught to say that, or trained. Perhaps they're even, kind of the emperor's new clothes kind of a deal. They don't actually believe it, but maybe some people do. Maybe some people have been brainwashed. Have you, and, it could be some, there are probably some works of art so-called, that do speak to people in particular circumstances. But anyways, do you see in the art world people, maybe children, be enthusiastic about traditional art, or even in college start out enthusiastic and then slowly go through that transition where they're more and more conflicted? Perhaps they slowly adopt. I would assume that is fairly common, but maybe you can speak to that.
It's hard because I've been out of, I guess, like art school for over 20 years, and I hate to admit that I don't go to a lot of art museums for modern. I hate modern art. So I don't know. My hope is that, because I don't know what's happening in colleges now, art schools. My hope is that, like we said, we get to some point where you're missing beauty and you want to go back to it. And I'm mostly surrounded by like illustration or a lot of artists that are in the animation industry. And so, actually, this is kind of separate, but it actually reminds me of this because I used to also want to be an animator for Disney growing up. And that was my dream. And then, of course, computers came and changed everything. But I will say, how traditional animation and drawing, like the old Disney movies, like 101 Dalmatians, all that was 2D, traditional, all hand-drawn. It was amazing. And when you still watch those films today, you can see all the line work and the beauty in all the hand-drawn work. And now, since the 90s, everything is now CG and computer graphics, and it's just perfect. And it's all done on a computer, and you miss the beauty in the hand-drawn. And what's happening is people are missing the original, like the traditional animation, and there's studios popping up, and they're starting to come back to doing traditional art. And so there's places in Ireland and other little studios that are popping up because they are missing it. So I am seeing it, at least in that industry. So
I just anecdotally, I have another friend who's an artist other than Julia, who her style in art school was oil painting, sort of Renaissance. She loved Rembrandt, and she got the same criticism as you, and she couldn't understand it. And this was around 20 years ago. They would just tear apart her work, which was beautiful. She's so talented, and she dropped out of art school, and she's just now started painting again. And I think that's really inspiring. But yeah, I think a lot, and I do think it's gotten worse in art school since you were there, because I know now they're trying to, just like the professor at Oxford who's trying to decolonize supposedly the music department, they're doing the same with literary works. They're removing classics, the justification being that these are works by straight white men, and therefore they've only been, they're at the top of the hierarchy because of systems of oppression, not because they have any value intrinsic. And they're doing the same with art. They're removing parts of art history.
The Eurocentric, patriarchal, right?
Yes.
So at the beginning, you were talking about why this movie might be hidden by the producers. And I don't know about you guys, but I've always been inspired to destroy or demolish ugly architecture. And I feel like this only reinforced that for me. Just because I feel like it's already built, there's nothing we can really do about it besides either make it beautiful or find beauty in its destruction.
Don't you love the line in the film, and I'm not going to be able to quote it, but it's something like, ornaments, right, free us from the tyranny of the useful, right? And we've inherited from the Puritans, unfortunately, within Christendom, we've inherited from the Puritans this idea that beauty of form is nothing, essentially. It's just superfluous. It's just extra or an add-on. In fact, it's dangerous because it can lure us away from the more important kind of beauty, which is spiritual beauty, right? But that doesn't match, though, with our experience. I mean, that's why we have ugly church buildings. And I came to faith in a particular tradition that essentially was the uglier the building, the more holy you were. I mean, it seemed to be, literally. But that doesn't match with our experience of just creation, right? There seems to be a principle of superabundance. Calvin liked to argue for God's existence based upon the existence of pears. We already have apples. Everything all the nutrition you'd get from an apple or from a pear you get from an apple. Why also have a pear, right? It's just super abundant. If you think of salvation itself, right? The idea of it's just not the forgiveness of sins and okay, you can kind of, be on the outskirts of the new heavens and new earth because of all of your transgressions against the kingdom of God, but it's full sonship, right? It's like the parable of the prodigal son, where the son returns and the father runs out to him and he embraces him and puts the best cloak on him and puts a ring on his finger. In God's view, it's a superabundance, right? So I used to really think of Catholic churches, these giant cathedrals, and they're just, you walk in them and you get that sense of the transcendent. And I used to say, that was done on the back of, these indulgences, and that's probably slightly true. But the more I looked into it, I realized these were entire communities that spent their whole lives pouring themselves into this building because they did it as a way of trying to create essentially this giant icon, this giant space that would help people come to know the transcendent. And I think it's superabundance is what we need, and there certainly is a tyranny of the useful, or tyranny of the what he calls it's the cult of ugly and the cult of utility, right? We have to push back against both those, I think.
He also said the buildings are built to be demolished. So
yeah, that's right.
I would be curious on some of the examples you guys might have about the people that are leaving you with the awe-inspired sense of beauty, people who are doing it right. Any examples that leave your jaw on the floor right now? Not in the past now.
Yeah. Well, this may not be a popular answer with this crowd, but I've been looking for people in different areas of entertainment who are going to start pushing back against the current culture. And I've been really inspired by this rapper named Tom McDonald. He is not a believer, as far as I know, although he's open to it. He has a new song out called Church. But he is inspiring to me because he is pushing back against this dominant belief system. He's got a song called Sober, which is about his sobriety. He's got songs that directly challenge social justice, like postmodernist Marxism. And he is seeing success, being completely independent and bucking what is now the cultural norm. He has no label behind him, no agent, no manager. There's no suits pushing him. The press hates him. They don't do puff pieces about him, certainly. In fact, they attack him and call him all the names that people get called these days, alt-right, white supremacists, etc., which are, none of those things are true about him. And yet, young kids have found him. Generation Z has found him. When I first started hearing about him, it was from adults who said, my 16-year-old has been listening to this guy. You got to check him out. And so he's had songs hit the #1 charts on his own. He does all the music. He produces it. His girlfriend shoots the videos. He builds his own sets. And I think he's very skilled and talented at what he does. And so I'm looking for people like that in other fields of art and entertainment. There's people doing it in comic books, because comic books have been faced an invasion with this ideology where a lot of old school comic book fans have seen their favorites sort of destroyed with social justice. And so now several comic book creators have been canceled for having the wrong opinions and have started their own independent comic books and are selling them, and are selling more than the mainstream comic book brands these days. So I think it's going to take a while before we see it in TV and film, although I know people are trying to push back. Daily Wire is now going to start putting out movies and TV shows and series and trying to compete. I don't know anything about pushback in the art world, though. So that's why. Do you know are there any artists you think are? I mean, Julia is my favorite.
No, I mean, there's Definitely, like I'm just thinking this artists I follow on Instagram. I mean, again, it's just amazing the cancel culture immediately if you post anything. I think an artist that I follow. I mean, it's just ridiculous. One thing she has like 500,000 followers, and I think she posted a picture. She drew a picture of is it Ronald? Oh, she just quoted Ronald Reagan, and they destroyed her on July 4th, and it's just horrible. And so, I mean, I know just not that we're necessarily fighting the SJW, but like even the art moms that I meet with once a month here in Austin, I mean, we're all creating our own, art, and we're traditional methods. And even if like it doesn't get published, we can self-publish, and we want to make beautiful stories. And so, I don't know. But I don't know like any big name artists that I know of.
Not yet.
Not yet. So.
That's a great question, Charlie, because, my initial reaction is, like most of the books I read are by dead people. Most of the art, like I'm a big fan of Baroque art, and so it's like I've sort of turned my back upon stuff that's being done now because so much of it is bad, but that's actually not the right move. We should be searching out people like Julia who are pushing back against this and really support those artists, because we need more of them, right? We need beauty, and so we need these artists to be supported and be able to do that. It's a great question.
By the way, the word that you were wanting to use earlier when you were saying garbage over and over again was avant-garbage.
Avant-garbage.
Yeah.
That is so funny. Yeah.
I wanted to say thank you first for putting this on. Unexpectedly, I wept in my seat the entire time. And I couldn't figure it out why I was so moved by the film until about halfway through. And for those of you who don't know me, hi, my name's Kate, and I was supposed to go to Eastman, which, if you don't know what Eastman is, it's a little bit above Juilliard in terms of their rating. And I didn't get to go to Eastman because of my conservative beliefs and what I posted on Facebook. They actually had a faculty meeting about me, and because my ideals didn't align with theirs, didn't have anything to do with my voice, because I made it past the blind audition and then onto the live one. And anyway, that's a little bit about me, my background. But before I tell you exactly why I wept, I have a question for y'all. Do you know about the transhumanism movement in art? Okay. Have you noticed in art lately how they'll be faceless in ads, and even in some children's stories that are coming out now, they won't have faces. They're taking away the faces of all these different races in food products that you buy, et cetera, et cetera. They're leaving white faces though. But anyway, I think after this film I realized what the largest assault to beauty is putting a mask on it, right? This whole past year, I couldn't figure out why it offended me so much and why I felt like, it's a lie, this entire thing. The fact that people are bearing false witness or being forced to bear false witness against themselves and each other. Truth, beauty, and goodness, they've twisted truth. They're taking away beauty by putting masks on it, and so you're left with no goodness but evil. And what are your thoughts on that?
That is such a great point, right? Our world has essentially become postmodern art, right? It's the erasing of the image of God in man. I don't know if Scruton says this in his film, but he talks about it a lot, which is to say that, when we have fellowship with each other, of course, most of it comes through the face and through the eyes, right? And he has this great thing when he talked about eros, this love of desire, right? And the difference between for that kind of love to be true versus it being corrupted, like when you start to want to consume this thing rather than just to contemplate it, right? And so he actually in his book on beauty has a lot to say on that subject. So Kate, I recommend you read that book because there's some really interesting things that correlate to what's going on.
So one of the things that really stuck out to me in that film was when Roger was interviewing the man, I forget his name, but in the art studio, and he asked him the question, what do you think this postmodern art does for people? And his response was, well, it's not like traditional art that makes people see something beautiful or above themselves or that they want to aspire to or something like that. And he said, what this art does is it makes people feel comfortable in their everyday lives. And kind of what I took from that is that I think there's something like on a spiritual level going on there where if you think about who wants us to feel like we are divine and that wants us to feel like there's something greater than us that we can aspire to, and that wants us to appreciate beauty and see beauty in art and each other and anything really, and who wants us to not see that and feel like there is nothing greater, right? And if we can be convinced that this is all there is, that's not God. That's the other end of the spiritual battle. And I think that just speaks to not only postmodern art, but any sort of ideology that teaches us to think that we're all there is, right? But what it results in is that people, like we've kind of talked about, is that people feel resentful. They feel empty, like they're missing that sort of meaning that we all need. And I drove down here from Fort Worth, so I was listening to some podcasts on the way, and I heard someone make the comment regarding these ideologies that it's like we're bees trying to convince each other that honey doesn't mean anything. So I thought that was pretty relevant to all of this.
Fantastic.
So, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for your comments.
Hi there.
I'm sorry, who are you?
I just had a question. So, talking about meaning and beauty in art, I guess I had a question. I wanted to ask kind of what you thought about. So, whether or not beauty or whether or not art that is considered, not beautiful, like we're referencing in the film, has place in our world today. Carrie and I were talking yesterday, and there's some examples of people who have mastered a craft. For example, in music and in popular music, for example, like an artist like Miles Davis, who mastered the art of classical music and bebop music, and then later in his career rebelled against himself and made this abstract music, or Picasso, who mastered classical painting and then later sort of rebelled against himself and society and created Cubism. And then you have several different examples of maybe a person who has learned the rules, learned how to color in the lines, and then broken the rules and created something completely different. But they lived in a world where they were free to express. They earned their living. They almost became caricatures of themselves, and still were able to just play this game of, well, I can do whatever I want, and you'll still pay me money. So that was almost a statement in and of itself. And then you have artists like you mentioned earlier, Caravaggio, who was a brilliant, one of the most brilliant painters that we've ever known. But he was a brawler, he was a sword fighter, he was a drunkard, and he didn't live in a time where he had the ability or the freedom to maybe explore what he could have done with his technique and express himself, because he was being supported by clergy. So my question is, I see that we're moving towards, or the discussion is discussing, bringing meaning back into art and bringing maybe truth or beauty back into art. But where do you feel even that in today's world, that that art that might be considered quote unquote ugly might even have a place at all?
That's a great question, because I think it is. I think we maybe are presenting. I think Scruton is trying to make a point, so he's simplifying it some, right? So I think of Andy Warhol might be a good example, right? I don't know that anybody knew this, but it turns out Andy Warhol was actually a very religious guy. He went to Mass at least once a week and sometimes every day. And when people didn't know that, they interpreted some of his artwork like the Last Supper scene, where it's just sort of an outline. He drains all the color out of it. Then he puts like a big GE logo on it. That this was more of the same, of just emptying it of all religious, emptying these symbols of all meaning, right, and all efficacy. And now people are interpreting him to be someone that's someone of faith who's wrestling with modernity, right? So in that artwork, I think you see a person who has faith on the one side, and then all of the challenges that modernity has brought against faith, and he's struggling with those two things, and it's coming out in his art. So in that sense, I don't know that I look at that and say, wow, that's a beautiful piece of art, but it's legitimate in the sense, I think, that this is a legitimate struggle that he's having. And so if we want to say that art is only that which is beautiful, there's I think you could include that in art and expand the definition a little bit, or there's some other category of this kind of expressivism that certainly has a place, right? Because when I look at Warhol's art now with that perspective, I think there's actually quite a bit to be gained by that. I think the danger, though, is this sort of ugliness for ugly's sake, right? This tearing down of the beautiful and attacking and destroying it, and destroying the human figure, and just wanting to sort of this, in a very resentful way, wanting to destroy meaning in every place that it comes. I think that's the danger. And I think part of what makes it so dangerous, and I think Scruton is sort of hinting at this here, which is to say that we're sort of experiencing the death of Christianity, right? And the death of people being religious just in general. Even in America now, the latest numbers are pretty terrible when it comes to people who are, who even just believe in a divine being. The numbers are shrinking. Generation Z is the most atheistic generation so far, by far, I think. Now, there's a lot of ways to sort of explain that way, to say that they're still spiritual, right? And I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a real atheist, because you'll meet somebody who says they're an atheist, and they absolutely love art, and they love that transcendent experience and all that, so they're connecting the transcendent in some way. But I think what the concern is for a society as a whole is religion if it disappears, which I don't think it ever will, but as it declines, and then beauty is destroyed. Like beauty is a way to sort of prevent just sort of the absolute collapse of all of that meaning. With a complete collapse, I mean, it could, God's common grace is lifted off, and we could have some, it could just be absolute anarchy, and it could go completely nuts. So, yeah, I take your point. That's a great way to refine the conception, because I really do appreciate, and I appreciate Picasso too. I don't place him in this postmodern frame of let's burn the house down, and if we die inside, we don't care kind of resentment. So, great question.
Okay. I thought of Picasso. That was the first thing I wanted to say, is when I was growing up and we were shown different artists, and they all seemed to be equally important, but Picasso just didn't ever sit right with me, for the Picasso that I was shown, and I thought I was supposed to like it, but so I felt at home with that. But the face, they talked about the face being the beginning of beauty, and Kate spoke to this already, the facelessness and sameness of the mask wearing, and sameness in general has already been getting out of hand for a long time. When I went to visit family in Maine, and a relative had the same tissue box in her house, and I thought, wow, we're just the globalism, sameness, the real diversity that's gets washed away and all this. And I love faces, and I love that they mentioned, beauty can be found in a young attractive person, but also in the aged, wise face. The most beautiful faces I know are old and tell a story and draw me in spiritually. And most of the men I've wanted to marry are dead. Like you said, most of the books you read are very... Like, I was in love with Thomas Jefferson for so long, it kind of got in the way of me having a real relationship with him. I felt like I was born 300 years too late. And then I crushed on Tesla for a while. It's not like what they do with him now. It's like the real Tesla, if you really know his heart and what he was doing. He was very inventive and creative and wanted good, unlike Edison, not a good guy. On the Eros part, that spoke to me too, because I thought of myself in different situations, two different situations, both with my heart completely open, unexpectedly, and just completely immersed in it. And in one, not really being loved, but being sought out for utility, and not like it just became, my spirit went into the pits of hell in that situation, and I could, but on the other side, being lifted up by the real kind of love that doesn't want to take advantage, that just breathes life back into you, that brought me closer to God and restored my spiritual, brought me back to heaven. It's just so. It's very true in the spirit, not just the visual, too, but just very good documentary. I'm so glad that y'all chose that. So thank you.
Thank you. We have to be out of here by 10. So let's take one more question or comment, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Sorry I had to run away earlier. I had a lot of water before the film, so. But I wanted to say that, it's been nice the past couple of weeks to see more faces around, and a lot of people will come up to me and say, wow, your voice is so amazing. I just have to stop and listen to you. I just want to listen to you. And what I have to say to that is, God doesn't care what our voices sound like so long as we're lifting them up to Him. And I want to encourage people. I imagine that God looks at each of us and sees our faces and is like, wow, that's awesome. Every time, it doesn't, I don't want to encourage you if you don't do it regularly. It doesn't matter what your face looks like. Just have your face out, because I don't care what somebody looks like now. When I see them, I'm like, hi, how are you? It's so nice to see you. And it really is. Because, yes, the beauty began in our face. God made our face. We are the ultimate in His creation, reflection of Him. And I wanted to go back to art, and you saying that, art shapes society. But whenever I was studying music, we had courses on how actually, music is shaped, or art is shaped by the society, not the other way around. And I feel like right now what we're seeing is the culmination of the Enlightenment period, which they kept bringing up like it's some great thing, but they divorced beauty from the sacred, and you can't really do that. You have to rectify both. And now that I was talking with Brad about this, and I think Ashley, that, Enlightenment is going to get kind of religious in my own opinion, so don't, take it as you will, but who parades around as an angel of light, and we're in the Enlightenment, and to be enlightened is to be somehow wise, and our wisdom is folly, right? And we're seeing the destruction of beauty here and now, and we have been. And who has wanted to destroy man since the beginning? Satan. And now we don't have our faces. I'm really bad at coming up with questions, but I have a lot of comments. So anyway, I'm sure you can have other things to say about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. But thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Remember, if you feel moved to do so, make a donation to the Palace Theater, because they really are struggling. And I mean, all this talk about beauty, it's important that we support local artists and as much as we can, those who create art that's beautiful, not that's ugly. But again, thank you for coming. If you're new to our congregation, if you're not familiar with the Church on the Square, we invite you to come and visit with us. We worship at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning here at the Palace. And so everybody here is invited to come and worship with us. And if you can, like the event page for the Church on the Square, because all future events will be posting those events. We plan to have more of these faith and film events, obviously, and other things that we're doing. So if you want to like our regular Facebook page and then also the COTS events page, then you'll keep up to date with what we're doing. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.